October 6th, 1907. Butler, Pennsylvania. Night presses down over the Standard Steel Car Company works, but inside the wheel plant there is no darkness, only furnace light. The building breathes in red and white. Iron glows, sand smolders, the air tastes of ash, hot metal, and oil. Men work inside a roar so constant it becomes a second climate, a pressure that lives in the ears and in the chest. Then, in one violent instant, the ordinary brutality of steel-making breaks open into something worse. A vessel of molten metal spills. It hits wet sand. The ground itself erupts. The blast is immediate. Steam flashes into force faster than the eye can follow. White-hot metal bursts upward and outward, thrown through the shop like liquid shrapnel. Witnesses describe a rain of fire falling back onto the men below. Some are struck where they stand. Some try to turn and run, but there is nowhere to go inside a room built around rails, molds, pits, and heat. Clothing catches. Skin burns, breath turns sharp and useless in the lungs. The wheel plant, roughly 150 feet long and 100 feet wide, becomes a chamber of pressure, flame, and screaming. Windows shudder. The shock is felt beyond the plant. Buildings in Butler tremble. People in town stop where they are and listen. What fails here is brutally simple. Molten metal meets trapped water. Water becomes expanding steam with explosive force. In a steel shop, that is enough. The floor is no longer a surface. It becomes a weapon. Men who spend their lives handling controlled heat are suddenly trapped inside heat that no human being can control. There is no heroic pause, no graceful chance to escape. Industrial death works too fast for that. At least 4 workers are dead. Around 30 more are burned, broken, or maimed, and the count may still rise before the fire is finished with them. Most of the men at the center of the blast are immigrant laborers. They stand closest to the heat, closest to the danger, closest to the point where production turns human beings into casualties. Before dawn, families wait for names. The fire keeps burning. Smoke hangs over Butler. The smell of scorched metal and flesh settles into the night. This is the story of why being a steel pourer in the 1900s can feel less like a trade than a sentence. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States does not simply use steel. It hungers for it. The nation expands on rails, rivets, beams, axles, wheels, bridges, ship plates, and factory frames. As cities rise through smoke, rail lines push deeper into the continent. Freight moves faster, farther, heavier. Everywhere, the same demand hardens into pressure. More steel, more output, less delay. That pressure reaches into places like Butler, Pennsylvania, where the Standard Steel Car Company grows with startling speed. The plant exists for one reason. Railroads need cars, and railroads need them now. In 1902, the company is founded to meet that appetite. Within a short span, its Butler works spread across dozens of acres and employ thousands of men. By 1903, roughly 3,000 workers are already there. By 1907, the company is producing more than 29,000 rail cars in a single year. The scale sounds like triumph in a boardroom. On the shop floor, it means 12-hour shifts, relentless furnace schedules, and human bodies arranged around heat so extreme it can turn a moment's failure into mass death. The national numbers explain why the pressure never loosens. Around 1900, the United States is producing more steel than Britain and Germany. More than 10 million metric tons pour out of American industry in a single year. That output becomes a kind of national boast, proof of strength, proof of modernity, proof that the country is rising faster than its rivals. Steel is sold to the public as achievement. It is shown in bridges, locomotives, towers, and machines. The men who pour it are rarely shown at all. Inside the mills and foundries, the reality is less grand and far more intimate. The work is lived through the skin. Heat presses against the face like an open furnace door that never closes. Vibration travels up through boot soles and into bone. Smoke hangs low. Dust settles into hair, clothes, and lungs. The smell is a mixture of oil, burnt sand, hot iron, and sweat that never fully leaves a man after his shift. Production is measured in tons and units, but the cost is measured in exhaustion, burns, crushed hands, scarred lungs, and names that disappear from payrolls. This is what industrial expansion looks like from below. Not abstract growth, not patriotic language. A worker standing a few feet from molten metal because the country wants speed and the company wants volume. If you value this kind of history told from the furnace floor instead of the executive office, subscribe now. The Steel Age promises strength. The system beneath it depends on weakness, silence, and risk pushed downward onto the men closest to the fire. A steel plant does not rest. That is the first truth a worker learns, and it is the truth that governs everything that follows. The furnaces burn day and night. Ladles move whether the sky outside is bright or black. Belts turn, cranes travel. Wheels, axles, castings, and rails pass from heat to handling to shaping in a chain that resists interruption. Inside that chain, men are expected to match the endurance of the machinery. The process itself explains the danger. Iron is heated until it becomes molten, a moving mass of white-orange metal so hot it throws light against walls and faces like a second sun. It has to be carried, poured, guided, and cast before it cools and hardens. That means vessels full of liquid metal swing overhead or roll across the floor near crews working in confined spaces. Sandbeds, molds, pits, rails, hooks. Tongs and cranes all have to work together with precision. If one part fails, the danger does not stay local. It spreads instantly through heat, weight, pressure, and momentum. A ladle does not spill like water. It drops a small river of fire. This is why continuous operation matters so much to management and so much more terribly to labor. Furnaces are expensive to shut down and difficult to restart. Delays cost money. Cooling metal costs money. Idle equipment costs money. So the entire system is built around keeping the flow unbroken. Men work 12-hour shifts because the plant is organized around heat that must keep moving. Day hands give way to night hands. Night hands give way to day hands. Sometimes the change itself is cruel, with men dragged between sleep and labor until the body no longer knows which hour belongs to rest. To an outsider, the plant can appear ordered. Tracks run in straight lines, molds are arranged in rows, tasks repeat with the rhythm of routine. But the order is deceptive. Beneath it sits permanent instability. Hooks bear impossible loads. Floors hide moisture. Sand shifts. Surfaces crack under thermal stress. Smoke and dust cloud the air. The roar of machinery swallows warnings before they reach the men who need to hear them. What looks disciplined from a distance feels different at ground level. It feels like standing inside a system that stays calm only as long as every weak point holds. And that is the cruelty of industrial steelmaking in this age. The worker does not enter a place that becomes dangerous when something goes wrong. He enters a place that remains dangerous every minute it is operating. The calm is only the surface. Or under it, hidden failures are already forming. The deadliest forces in a steel plant are often invisible. Fire announces itself. Falling iron makes noise. A swinging ladle can be seen if a man has one clear second to look up. But the threats that prepare a preventable disaster usually arrive without shape, without color, without mercy. Inside the works, danger lives in the air and under the floor. Carbon monoxide gathers where combustion is incomplete, a poison with no warning cry of its own. Dust rises from ore, coke, sand, and scale, then hangs in the heat until it enters the lungs and stays there. Moisture hides in sand beds, brickwork, pits, seams, and low spots on the floor. That moisture matters. When molten metal strikes trapped water, the water does not simply evaporate. It expands with explosive force into steam. A damp surface becomes a bomb mechanism. Men walking the shop floor cannot always detect which patch of ground is merely dirty and which patch is waiting to erupt. Then there is fatigue, another invisible agent, slow and systematic. 12-hour shifts grind attention down to the nerve. Heat drains judgment. Roaring machinery blunts hearing. Vibration climbs through the legs and settles into the spine. Smoke and grit sting the eyes until a worker begins to see through a permanent haze. Under those conditions, the body still moves, but not cleanly. A hand is slower. A warning is missed. A shouted instruction disappears into clangor. In plants filled with immigrant labor, language gaps make the danger worse. Orders can be heard but not understood. A man can stand close to death and still not know exactly what the foreman is trying to prevent. The equipment carries its own hidden weakness. Iron hooks fatigue. Surfaces crack from repeated heating and cooling. Linings wear thin. Supports shift under strain. None of that announces itself in a language the men can trust. The system depends on constant motion, and constant motion is the enemy of careful inspection. It is cheaper to keep the heat moving than to stop and question every doubt, every rattle, every bad feeling in the gut. This is what makes the shop so cruel. A worker is not only facing the dangers he can see, he is surrounded by the ones he cannot. If you have ever heard industrial death dismissed as simple carelessness, leave a comment, because this is the point where the lie begins to crack. Across the steel districts, the same hidden threats keep surfacing in different buildings, under different company names, with the same result. Soon, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Butler is not a lone horror. Long before the floor there turns to fire, the steel districts are already sending up warnings in smoke, steam, and burned flesh. The industry keeps treating each one as a separate misfortune. The pattern says otherwise. In January 1907, at the Jones and Laughlin Eliza works in Pittsburgh, a blast furnace explosion hurls molten metal through the plant. Men are showered with white-hot iron. Contemporary reports describe workers burned where they stand, with at least 3 killed immediately and others so badly injured that the death toll rises afterward. The force is not mysterious. Hot material escapes confinement, pressure releases, and the plant becomes a killing field in seconds. The same year in Youngstown, men working beneath blast furnaces to clear accumulated dust are struck when hot material slips inside the stack. One worker is buried and dies in agony. Another escapes with severe burns. In South Chicago, journalist William B. Hard records another death inside U.S. Steel's South Works. A giant ladle of molten slag spills after a hook slips from an insecure attachment, and a man is roasted alive because the vessel is not fitted with proper lugs to hold it safely. The details shift from city to city. The structure of failure does not. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. Different plants, different company names, same industrial grammar. Extreme heat, heavy suspended loads, defective fittings, dust, fatigue, confusion. Are men sent back into danger because stopping production is always treated as more serious than questioning the system. The technical causes are plain enough for anyone willing to look. Moisture under hot metal creates explosive steam. Suspended ladles need secure points of support. Dust and waste under furnaces do not simply dirty a workplace, they create unstable, deadly conditions. But warnings that should be read as engineering evidence are stripped down and filed away as local trouble, an unfortunate shift, a bad crew, a failed component. That narrowing is part of the negligence. Once every disaster is described as isolated, no company has to admit that the danger is built into the way the work is organized. By 1907, the evidence is already spread across the map. Steelmaking is not producing a few freak catastrophes. It is producing a repeating chain of preventable disasters, each one exposing the same contempt for margins, maintenance, and human survival. And outside the plants, whole towns keep building their lives in the shadow of that chain because the jobs that threaten them are also the jobs that feed them. The danger does not end at the factory gate. It follows the workers home. In places like Butler, Pennsylvania, the steel plant is not a structure standing apart from ordinary life. It is the center of ordinary life. Streets, houses, boarding rooms, shops, and kitchens all arrange themselves around the needs of the mill, and that means entire families learn to live inside the shadow of industrial risk. Standard steel car grows so quickly that housing rises beside it almost as fast as the buildings of the works themselves. Lindora is built to hold the labor force the company requires. Rows of workers' homes and crowded lodging spaces fill with immigrant families and single men drawn by wages, however dangerous the source. By 1903, the Butler plant covers about 55 acres and employs roughly 3,000 workers. That number means more than payroll. It means thousands of people tying food, rent, coal, and survival to one employer and one system of production. When the whistle sounds, the town moves with it. The daily routine is harsh and narrowing. 12-hour shifts consume the useful hours of a man's life. He leaves before daylight or returns long after dark, carrying the smell of burnt sand, oil, smoke, and hot metal back into the house with him. Dust settles into cuffs and hair. Heat lingers in the skin. A fatigue sits so deep in the body that conversation becomes difficult. Wives, parents, and children learn to read the plant indirectly, through the whistle, through the delay of footsteps, through rumors moving down the street faster than official news. Economic dependence turns fear into something ordinary, not small, ordinary. That dependence is its own form of exposure. The family is not standing beside the ladle or the furnace, but it lives under the same system. A preventable disaster in the mill can wipe out the wage earner in a single shift and collapse the household with him. Rent still comes due. Food still has to be bought. Children still need shoes. The injury reaches beyond the body because industrial labor binds the workers home to the company's pace and priorities. So the town breathes with the mill, it breathes its smoke, and its dust, its money, and its danger. Risk becomes normalized because refusing it means hunger. That is how a community learns to endure what should never be treated as normal. And when the feared moment finally comes, the plant does not suffer alone. The whole town enters the blast with it. It happens too fast for thought. One moment the wheel plant is all routine heat and disciplined motion, and the next the floor itself becomes an instrument of death. Inside the Standard Steel Car Company works in Butler, Pennsylvania. The night shift moves through the familiar violence of steelmaking. The air trembles with machinery. Chains strain overhead. Iron rails hum under weight. The shop glows in bands of orange and white. furnace light striking smoke and dust until the whole interior seems to pulse. Or men work close to the ladles because the work gives them no choice. Molten metal has to be moved while it is still alive with heat, still fluid enough to pour, still bright enough to hurt the eyes. Then the sequence breaks. A vessel of molten metal overturns or spills. Several thousand pounds of white-hot material hit wet sand below. In that instant, the plant stops being a workplace and becomes a blast chamber. The physics are simple, and that simplicity is what makes the destruction so terrible. Water trapped in sand or under the surface meets metal heated far beyond the point of ordinary combustion. It flashes into steam almost instantly. Steam expands with explosive force. Pressure rises before any human reflex can answer it. This is not a slow spread of fire, it is a violent conversion of heat into shock. Oh, the blast throws metal outward in a scalding arc. Witnesses describe a rain of molten iron falling back through the shop. Men nearest the spill are struck where they stand. Others hear only a cracking roar and then feel impact, heat, and the tearing sting of liquid metal on cloth and skin. There is no real avenue of escape. A casting shop is crowded with rails, molds, pits, supports, and overhead handling gear. Visibility collapses in smoke, sparks, and dust. The roar becomes unbearable and then, for some, gives way to a sudden silence inside the head, the stunned blankness that follows pressure and shock. A worker tries to turn. Another drops where he is. Another raises an arm against a force that cannot be stopped by muscle, instinct, or prayer. Clothes ignite. Boots slip on hot sand. Breath comes in fragments. Unsharp with the taste of scorched air and metal, the body is asked to survive conditions it is not built to endure even for a second. This is the core truth of the steel pourer's life in the early 1900s. He stands beside controlled catastrophe for wages, trusting that the vessel will hold, the floor will stay dry, the hook will not fail, the shift will end before the system asks for blood. When that trust breaks, it breaks all at once. No courage can outrun physics. No experience can negotiate with molten iron once it is loose. The first men die at the point of failure, but the violence does not stay there. Heat, fire, wreckage, and panic begin moving outward through the plant, beyond the epicenter, into everything around it. The first blast is only the beginning. In a steel plant, once molten metal escapes control, and the building itself begins to betray the men inside it. At Butler, the force of the eruption does not stop at the point where the metal strikes wet sand. It moves outward through the wheel plant in heat, pressure, falling debris, and fire. The interior is built for production, not survival. Roof supports, overhead gear, rails, molds, wooden elements, oil, dust, and packed work zones turn a single failure into widening destruction. The air fills with smoke so thick it blurs distance and direction. Sparks whip through it like driven shot. The roar of the first explosion gives way to another sound just as terrible, metal clanging loose, timbers failing, men shouting names that cannot be heard clearly over the fire. This is why containment becomes almost impossible. A steelworks concentrates danger by design. Huge amounts of heat are held in one place. Heavy handling systems move suspended loads through enclosed spaces. Floors are layered with sand, scale, slag, and hidden dampness. When a blast tears through that arrangement, it does not leave behind a neat center and safe edges. It creates secondary hazards everywhere at once. Burning metal can splash far beyond the original spill. Fire can catch on structures and spread. Wreckage can trap men who survive the first shock only to die in the heat that follows. The destruction reaches beyond the immediate work crew. Men farther from the epicenter can still be burned by flying metal or struck by falling material. Those outside the building hear the concussion, feel the vibration underfoot, and then see smoke and flame rising where a shift had been proceeding only moments earlier. Buildings in Butler shake. Alarm moves through the town before facts do. Crowds gather because industrial communities understand what a fire at the works can mean. It may mean jobs lost. It may mean missing fathers and sons. It may mean bodies so badly burned that identification itself becomes uncertain. For the workers still inside, the problem is no longer only the original preventable disaster, it is the expanding field of consequences around it. A man who escapes the blast may find his path cut off by fire. A rescuer may reach the doorway and discover that the heat drives him back. The plant cannot absorb its own violence because it has been organized to maximize output, not to survive failure. And once the flames begin to subside, another reckoning starts. The noise leaves first. The counting comes after. After the roar, there is counting. That is how industrial grief begins. The fire still throws heat into the night, smoke still drifts over Butler, and already the town is trying to learn who has been taken. At least 4 workers are dead after the explosion at the Standard Steel Car Company works. Around 30 more are burned, broken, or maimed, and some are so badly injured that the final toll remains uncertain in the first hours. Numbers come first because numbers are what the newspapers can print quickly. But inside the town, loss is not a figure. It is a door that does not open at the usual hour. It is a wife listening for boots that never reach the porch. It is a boarding house waiting through the night while the smell of smoke and the hot metal still hangs in the air. It is children asleep in one room while adults whisper names in another. Many of the men closest to the blast are immigrant laborers, recent arrivals drawn into the steel districts by wages that promise survival and deliver danger. They work the hottest jobs, the dirtiest jobs, the jobs nearest the vessels and the furnaces. When a preventable disaster tears through the plant, those men pay first. Some are killed immediately. Some die later from burns that no ordinary medicine of the time can truly answer. Some are injured in ways that leave them alive, but no longer able to labor, which in a working-class household can mean a different kind of ruin. That is the deeper human toll. A steel pourer is never the only one standing beside the ladle. His family stands there too, economically, even from miles away. Wages vanish with the body that earns them. Rent remains. Food still has to be bought. Debts do not burn away with the dead. In towns shaped by one employer, grief and economic devastation arrive together, each one making the other harder to bear. The plant can replace a worker on paper. A family cannot replace a husband, a son, a father, a brother. The dead leave behind more than vacancies in a shift roster. They leave silence in kitchens, unfinished plans, empty beds, and households forced to survive the aftershock of industrial loss. And once the burials begin, another process begins with them, the official search for causes, blame, and a version of the truth narrow enough for the system to survive. After the dead are counted, the system begins its second defense. It does not begin with mourning. It begins with explanation. And explanation in industrial America is often a way of reducing the size of guilt. And in the aftermath of a preventable disaster like Butler, the immediate questions come quickly. What spilled? What broke? Which vessel failed? Where the men were standing? Whether the floor was damp? Those questions matter, but they also keep attention fixed on the smallest visible point of failure. A molten metal blast can be described as a technical event, and in one sense it is. Heat meets trapped moisture. Water flashes into steam. Pressure expands violently. Metal erupts outward. But technical truth becomes evasive when it is stripped from the conditions that make it likely. Wet sand does not become deadly on its own. A dangerous vessel is not handled in isolation. Men are not placed beside molten metal by chance. This is where official inquiry often grows selective. It focuses on the failed component, the upset pot, the careless moment, the local condition at the floor. It asks what happened at the instant of destruction and avoids the harder question of why the system is arranged so that one failure can kill so many men so quickly. It is easier to blame a hook, a surface, a motion, or a single worker than to confront fatigue, production pressure, weak inspection, indifferent maintenance, and the permanent sacrifice of safety, margins to output. Narrow findings preserve broad habits. For the worker and his family, that narrowing has consequences. Once blame is reduced to a detail, responsibility shrinks with it. The dead become casualties of circumstance instead of victims of a labor system that treats danger as an acceptable operating condition. The injured are folded back into paperwork. And the plant is discussed as damaged property before it is discussed as a site of human destruction. Repairs begin. Production resumes. What should become a reckoning becomes a restoration. This pattern is part of the negligence. The investigation does not always lie outright. It simply stops too soon. It identifies the nearest cause and leaves the deeper causes untouched because those deeper causes are expensive, embarrassing, and built into the way industrial power functions. A floor can be dried, a vessel can be replaced, a report can be filed, but the same long shifts remain, the same pressure to keep heat moving remains, the same imbalance between profit and human survival remains. And once the machinery starts again, the public is invited to believe the lesson has been learned. The record suggests something colder. The lesson is learned only in part, and only enough to keep the system running until the next preventable disaster asks the same question again. The most disturbing fact is not that men die in steel plants. It is that their deaths fit the economics of the system. The furnaces keep burning because stopping them costs money, and once profit is placed above interruption, every safeguard begins to look expensive. Steelmaking in the early 1900s depends on continuous motion. Heat has to be maintained. Metal has to move before it cools. Orders have to be filled on time. Railroads, factories, and markets do not wait, and the companies tell themselves that they cannot wait either. That logic travels downward until it reaches the worker's body. 12-hour shifts become normal because shutdowns are costly. Inspections are shortened because delays are costly. Repairs are postponed because delays are costly. Extra staffing, clearer training, better equipment, and wider safety margins all face the same quiet accusation: too expensive. Under that pressure, danger is not removed. It is distributed downward onto the men nearest the furnaces. This is why the deaths keep recurring across different towns and different companies. The problem is not only a bad floor, a weak hook, or a single failed vessel. The problem is an industrial culture that treats casualties as absorbable. In many cases, a dead worker costs the company less than a serious redesign of the system that killed him. Compensation is meager or absent. Grieving families carry the long burden while production resumes. The business absorbs a brief disruption, and the household absorbs the permanent wound. Workers understand this more clearly than management likes to admit. They feel it in the pace of the shift, in the pressure to keep moving, in the shouted order that overrides caution, in the dull fatigue that settles behind the eyes while the heat keeps roaring. They know that refusing unsafe work can mean losing wages they cannot afford to lose. They know that many of the most dangerous jobs fall to immigrants, the poor, and the replaceable. Power in the mill is never equally distributed. Risk follows the same hierarchy. Regulation remains weak, inspection inconsistent, and corporate reform partial. That is why the same pattern survives. The industry praises toughness because toughness is cheaper than protection. It speaks of discipline because discipline costs less than redesign. It accepts a level of death that would be intolerable if the victims were not workers standing below the line of financial importance. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. Leave it in the comments. Once a system learns that human loss can be folded into the price of doing business, the next preventable disaster is never far away. The fire goes out, the lesson does not. That is the final burden these steel towns carry. The smoke lifts, the rubble is cleared, the shift resumes somewhere, and the dead still keep teaching a truth the industry resists. A preventable disaster like Butler leaves behind more than burned timbers and broken equipment. It leaves a record. It leaves testimony in scar tissue, in newspaper columns, in wage books interrupted by death, in families forced to measure progress against the men it consumes. In the years that follow, some things do change. Public pressure grows. Investigations become harder to bury completely. Workers' compensation laws begin to spread. Safety committees appear. Companies under scrutiny start investing money in procedures, inspections, guards, training, and formal oversight they once treated as optional. Reform arrives, but it arrives late. And it arrives because too many workers have already paid for it with their bodies. That is the clearest technical and moral lesson. Industrial safety is rarely granted in advance. It is usually extracted after blood has already marked the floor. The dangers in steelmaking are not mysterious. Heat, steam, suspended weight, fatigue, dust, gas, poor maintenance, and production pressure can all be understood. The question is never whether the risks are knowable. The question is whether those in power are willing to slow the system, spend the money, and value the worker before the next preventable disaster forces the issue again. For the men inside the mills, the stakes are never abstract. A safety rule is not a line in a manual. It is the difference between returning home and vanishing into the payroll record as another replacement. A dry floor, a properly secured ladle, a halted shift, a repaired hook, a shorter schedule, a warning taken seriously. These are not minor decisions. They are choices about whether a worker's life is treated as part of the cost of production or as something that cannot be bargained away. So this is the legacy the fire leaves behind. Not a neat story of progress. A warning. Whenever output is worshipped, whenever delay is treated as a greater sin than death, whenever labor is made cheap enough to replace, the furnace begins asking for bodies again. Remember the steel pourers. Remember the burned, the crushed, the buried, the unnamed. And if this history matters, subscribe and leave your thoughts below, because memory is one of the few protections the dead can still demand from the living.